They put a sheet over my face and wrote down a time of death, but I was still listening. Day 0. 16 hours of labor. Every one of them felt like a lifetime. I remember the fluorescent glare, the rubber smell of the delivery room, the way the monitor's steady beeping became my only rhythm. I remember Andrew, my husband, more in the periphery than by my side, a hand that hovered, a phone that buzzed more than his concern. I remember saying more than once that something didn't feel right. The nurse told me to keep breathing. The next thing I knew, there was shouting, metal on metal, and someone saying the word hemorrhage like it was a sentence already written. They worked. Machines flared. I drifted into a place where light was a rumor, and sound was muffled, but not gone. Then a doctor said words that would invert my life. They declared me dead during childbirth. I have to say those words straight. Declared me dead during childbirth. It sounds impossible when you say it aloud. It sounded impossible to me when I heard it from the other side of my own silence. I remembered the sheet. It was heavy like finality, cold like the room that becomes a coffin. I remembered the distinct clatter of rubber soles in the corridor and the faint smell of coffee. I remember being aware, awareness with no way to reach for the world. The medical staff did what they do. They documented, they moved through protocol. Nurses said the time, someone whispered condolences. I could hear the whispers, the soft taps of a keyboard, the voice that announced time of death. I could not move. I could not speak. My body had become a cell with a single witness inside. They told me later that I was in what they called a locked-in state. I won't pretend to be an expert on medicine. I will say what I lived. Consciousness without movement. Sound with no response. I heard everything. I was awake in a place where the rest of the world assumed I was gone. Day 3. That assumption turned into celebration. I have had people tell me that betrayal is always subtle, small choices that add up. The betrayal I lived through started blunt and loud. While I lay beneath a sheet and machines recorded my heart's silent press, the people I loved and trusted began to make other plans. The first sign came through voices. A nurse I had come to trust, her voice was a thin line of gossip and sorrow, said, "They're talking about the funeral, but honestly, there's the life insurance." Another voice, colder, a woman with crispness in her vowels, said, "We need to think about the babies and the money." The name Margaret was used like a brand, calm, precise. My chest tightened, though I could not move. I heard Andrew on the phone, voice clipped. "Yes, make sure the paperwork's in order. We don't want any surprise claims." To hear your husband prioritize paperwork over questions about you is a particular kind of pain. But it got worse. A new voice threaded into the room like a stain. Jennifer, his assistant, whose laugh someone described for me as too bright for a funeral. I learned later that by day 3, they had thrown a welcome home party for the baby. A photo on a phone showed Jennifer in a dress, standing too close to the bassinet, wearing something of mine. Someone called it unfortunate. Someone else called it brash. The nurse who came onto my floor whispered, "They changed the baby's name. They already started calling her by the other name they picked." The party was not a private thought. It became a motion, a proof. Someone took pictures. Someone uploaded them. Nurses and hospital staff that I had known for years came to me, eyes wide with a mixture of shame and fear. A social worker visited quietly and later told my father what she'd heard in the hallway. Plans to wait 30 days, then to press for removal of life support, to claim the insurance as though grief were a transaction to be closed. My parents were kept out. My father remembers the phone call that day, Andrew saying, It's better if your family doesn't come to the hospital right now. The baby needs rest. I remember the way those words were a lock. I remember overhearing Margaret say, as if rehearsing a will, "We wait 30 days. The policy is clear. After that, we can proceed." I remember Jennifer's voice, "We'll find a buyer, private sale. People will pay." You should understand the moral drop here, the place where a family member calculates that your dying body is an impediment to a profit. They moved past grief and landed in calculation with terrifying efficiency. It was like watching a car swerve into someone and check the dent, not the person. There was a sliver of light. Before I went under, I had done things that felt like small acts of paranoia, and thank God I had done them. 2 weeks before my due date, I had updated my will. It was a blunt, practical document. If anything were to happen to me, custody of my children would default to my parents. I had also talked to my father's lawyer and told him where to find the documents. I had installed a small security camera in the living room of our house because of a feeling I couldn't shake. No dramatic motive, just a hunch that if anything ever happened, I wanted to know what happened in my own home. No one knew about the camera but me and one trusted friend. I tucked bank statements into an envelope and told my mom, if something ever goes wrong, look for the green folder. Those acts felt trivial in the moment, like checking your brakes before a drive. They would turn out to be the only thing between my children and a plan that should have belonged in a dystopian novel. Day 20. Dr. Martinez walked into the room and changed everything. He was a man of quiet habits, efficient, professional, and he spoke directly. There are two. The sentence landed in my quiet like a hand on a lighter. Twins. The second baby had not been announced in the flurry of birth paperwork and the public images. We had not known we were having twins, he explained, clinically, that there had been a second little body, smaller, under the same sheet of confusion, delivered and assessed. There were 2 children to account for, 2 lives stitched into one day of chaos. When Dr. Martinez said there were 2, the tone of the room shifted from shock to calculation. I could hear Margaret in the background, voice cold with resolve. One is easier. The other can be handled. I remember the particular way her words slid into a conversation about resources, about buyers, as if children were property to be auctioned. Jennifer's laugh came like a knife. Someone suggested a private sale. Nurses exchanged looks that said, "Is this actually happening?" At that point, the stakes were no longer only about money. They were about the safety of 2 newborns. The hospital social worker, who had been quietly appalled from the start, said my parents should be contacted immediately. My father's lawyer, who had the will and the green folder, began assembling evidence the moment he heard Dr. Martinez confirm twins. He instructed a friend to pull the security footage I had hidden at home and to begin subpoenaing records. He told my mother to write down every name, every time, to preserve what she could. I want to be precise about what I heard in those weeks because the details matter. Nurses' statements about overheard plans, the bank statement showing transfers that made no sense, a note in my husband's calendar that read, "Insurance consult," next to the date of my labor. They weren't incidental. They were a paper trail. My father's lawyer found text messages in which Andrew discussed covering expenses and a message from Margaret about liquidating assets. These weren't the fabrications of grief. They were the bones of a conspiracy. Day 29. For 29 days, I had been a spectator in my own life. I had the tape of their voices. I had the knowledge that the removal of life support was a legal threshold they intended to cross after 30 days. I had the will, the camera footage from home that showed a welcome home party with too much wine and too few mournful faces, and bank records that traced small, suspicious withdrawals. I had told the hospital social worker everything I could in a voice that was whisper-strong and terrible in its intensity, what little I could manage with blinking and eye tracking, and I had listened as the social worker and a nurse arranged calls, quietly, as if building a bridge under a storm. The movement was small at first, a twitch, a finger, then a hand. The nurses told me that later, when Dr. Martinez came by that morning, he remarked on a slight reflex. For me, it was like a spark in a flood, a single stitch that began to hold the seam of my life together. I remember feeling the corners of my chest pull, as if something inside wanted to speak and found a way. I remember saying, "babies," with a voice that was hardly more than a breath. Someone in the room, one of the nurses who had been my secret ally, heard it and ran. She called in the social worker, the neurologist, my father's lawyer. My eyelids betrayed me and fluttered. My eyes, so much a prison, opened. My first sight was the white of a hospital ceiling and the shocked face of a nurse who had been reading the party photo on a phone and hung up as if the picture had burned her. If you want to know what it feels like to be inside a body that has to relearn speech, imagine learning the alphabet bar by bar, sound by sound. But awakening came with furious clarity. I remembered the conversations. I remembered voices. I remembered Margaret's cold plan. I remembered Jennifer's laugh. There is a moment when the world shifts from danger to possibility, and I reached it on day 29. I used every fragile syllable to name what I had heard. I told Dr. Martinez, I told the nurses, I told the social worker. They're planning to take the support. They're planning to sell one of them. My voice was a whisper that steadied with each repetition. The hospital staff, who until then had been both witnesses and potential victims of the scheme's momentum, let out a collective breath. My father's lawyer burst through the door within an hour, documents and a terse energy that sounded like a gavel. Those who had been celebrating misinterpreted the world in their own favor. They had stalked their courage according to the number 30. They had plans written in private messages, lists of buyers, a shorthand for how to rearrange funerals and paperwork. They thought 30 days was a safe boundary. They were wrong. Day 30, the day they planned to remove life support, turned into the day they walked into an ICU and were met by the police. The scene could have been surreal if it hadn't been so real. Andrew's face when he saw me opening my eyes, Jennifer trying for a moment to collect herself into plausibility, Jennifer's hands fumbling for a narrative that would explain pictures and messages and bank records. The room hummed with authority. My father, my parents' lawyer, hospital administration, and officers. The hidden security camera footage from our home, grainy but unmistakable, was shown to a detective. It captured the welcome home party, a cake with my name, guests laughing, Jennifer wearing my scarf, a toast that called me gone like it was already done. The bank statements showed transfers taken from accounts that had been moved without my authorization in those first frantic days. Nurses who had recorded their observations of whispered plans stepped forward. It was as if the small pricks of truth we had gathered became pins that burst the whole ugly thing. There are practicalities in such moments that feel almost cinematic. A badge flashed, a soft command to step aside, cuffs clicking. There is also a moral sanction. We had turned a family act into a criminal enterprise. Andrew was arrested on charges that included conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder in the broad sense of conspiring to remove life. Margaret and Jennifer were arrested for conspiracy and for attempted trafficking and fraud. I'm not a person who likes to list punishments as trophies, but for the record, because it matters and was part of the justice that followed, the sentences were handed down months later. Andrew received 8 years, Margaret 5 years, Jennifer 3 years. Court was about more than punishment. It was about recognition of what had almost been done and the protection of my children afterward. I don't tell you about the arrests to indulge in revenge. I tell you because the law, imperfect, slow, necessary, was the instrument that made sure the next chapter would belong to my children and to me. The legal outcome included an explicit custody ruling. The court granted legal custody to my parents as my designated guardians. The judge also ordered that the insurance proceeds be placed into a trust for the children, with my father's lawyer as trustee. There is a restraining order that keeps those three away from me and my children. These were practical barricades that allowed us to build forward. But I need you to understand what won us that day and the months that followed. It wasn't a dramatic swipe from a single piece of evidence. It was a chain, an updated will, a hidden camera, bank statements that didn't match behavior, nurses who kept notes, a social worker who moved the right phone calls, my father's lawyer who, modest and efficient, read the law like a map. Every small practical thing I'd done because of an anxious premonition became a link in a chain sturdy enough to pull us out. There were personal devastations that no court could erase. The discovery that your husband and your mother-in-law moved from grief to gain with this speed, the knowledge that someone could conceive of selling a child like a commodity, those are things that leave marks. But justice had teeth. My children were safe in my parents' care. The trust prevented an immediate liquidation. The restraining order was a buffer. The convictions were a public naming of what had been attempted. Recovery after that is its own story. Rehabilitation, the physical therapy that rebuilt my voice and my limb strength, was a slow work of art. I learned how to hold my daughters. I learned the small practices of mothering that do not come from law or court records, but from waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of breathing and knowing it belongs to you. I wrote down what I heard, not to make money, but to create a record. That record became a book that sold enough copies to create a modest platform. With that platform, I started speaking about patients' rights, about the ethics of family decision-making in medical crises, about the ways institutions can be weaponized by people closest to you. People asked me what it felt like when Dr. Martinez revealed the twins. The truth is, there was a double shock, pain, and an ugly calculus that followed. Dr. Martinez had saved lives that day. His actions in the delivery room were clinically appropriate, careful, attentive. But the existence of the second baby created more human stakes and a more clipped moral timeline for those who wished to divert those lives for profit. It made the conspiracy sharper. It made us fight with a more urgent edge. I want to say a word here about the staff at the hospital. Not everyone there was complicit. Some were quietly horrified. Some came forward and gave statements. One nurse, Maria, testified in court. She described the party, the changed name on the bassinet, the way Jennifer tried to shepherd visitors away from the room with excuses about privacy. Her testimony was plain and powerful. The social worker's notes were clinical and devastating, details that read like a ledger of moral choices. Those statements mattered. And then there were the small, humane things. Friends of mine, people I'd known since college, women I had worked with in the PTA, brought meals to my parents and sat with the girls on Sundays. A neighbor drove an hour to bring a knitted blanket for the twins. One of Andrew's relatives, embarrassed and remorseful, came to court and testified that she had been urged to keep quiet. She did not, and that refusal made a difference. These human details are easy to lose in headlines, but they are what kept my children connected to a community that chose them as its own. I am asked sometimes if I forgave. Forgiveness is complicated. It is not a public document. The simplest truth I can give is this: I let the law do the punishing it was meant to do. I reclaimed my energy for the future. I did not spend my life tracking their absences like a ledger. Violence and betrayal have a way of seducing you into making them central. I chose to make my daughters central instead. There were practical challenges along the way. The trust paperwork dragged in court like thick molasses. Some people suggested cashing out the insurance to pay for therapy, but my father's lawyer insisted on a trust, because you never know who might try again. Custody hearings involved guardianship procedures and evaluations. We walked through it all in courts that smelled like old wood and Lauren Bacall microphones. There were reporters who wanted the angle that sold, and I refused some interviews that would have bitten into the privacy of my children. Advocacy work opened other doors, meetings with hospital ethics boards, panels where I insisted on clearer policies about family members' financial interests during a patient's incapacity. The healing part of the story is not tidy. I still wake up sometimes with that sheet over my face in the dream that makes my throat close. I still feel reluctant to hand my oldest to strangers. But I also keep a photograph on my phone of a park bench where the twins tumbled over each other, laughing, grass in their hair. There is a moment when Hope, my older by a few precious minutes, reached for Grace's hand and wouldn't let it go. The two of them together are a little instrument of joy that rings every day. 3 months after the arrests, the sentences were read. The courtroom felt like a theater of both closure and beginning. Andrew's sentence, 8 years, was less than what I had imagined in the worst nights of my recovery. But the law measured the damage against statutory scales and available charges. Margaret received 5 years. Jennifer got 3. The judge also signed the restraining order and the custody designation. We felt the weight lift a fraction. I learned to speak to people who had been through terrible things, other mothers whose births had turned into court cases, families who had been betrayed by someone on the inside. I began to teach others about the small things that change outcomes: the will, the camera, the green folder. Those sound like mundane objects. They are not glamorous. They are not a dramatic reveal in a movie. They are paperwork and a piece of plastic with a recording chip. They are the difference between losing everything and being able to hold someone accountable. There is something I want to press on carefully. Awakening is not a miracle guaranteed to anyone. Do not read my story as a promise that you will emerge. Read it as a record of one improbable survival and as a sermon about readiness. Doctors told me later that my recovery was unusual. They said words about neurologists' caution and the rare phenomenon of regaining motor control after a locked-in state. I accepted their medical framing. I am not here to argue medicine. I am here to tell you that when I awoke, I did 2 things, instantly and with full clarity. I named my daughters, and I told the hospital everything I had overheard. My parents did what parents do. They turned fear into motion. My father called his lawyer. My mother wrote down dates and phrases with a hand that shook. My parents' lawyer, who had spent evenings reading documents, and the will I had signed, became the spine of our legal strategy. He compiled the security footage from our house, gathered bank statements that showed transfers out of our accounts, collected witness statements from nurses, and filed the necessary documents to block any attempt to move the children. Without that legal foothold, we might have lost the chance to secure the trust and the custody that protect the girls now. I think about those first days a lot. I think about the small actions that feel like paranoid hedges and how they become lifelines: an updated will, a camera, a law firm card in your purse. If there is any practical advice I can give without presuming I'm an expert, it's this: document anything that feels wrong, talk to a lawyer if you feel unsafe, and make sure someone outside the immediate circle knows where critical papers are. Those are not guarantees against evil, but they are prudent steps. In the months after trial, I began to speak in small rooms. Mothers' groups invited me to talk about patient autonomy. Hospital ethics boards asked me to speak about conflicts of interest when family members stand to gain from a patient's death. I testified before a panel that drafted suggested guidelines for hospitals on how to flag unusual financial activity in the families of incapacitated patients. Those are modest victories, but they felt like placeholders for the larger outcome, preventing what nearly happened to us from happening to another family. The epilogue is not a tidy epiphany, but a daily practice. My children, Hope and Grace, are now toddlers who cling to my fingers like they will never let go. My hands, once a prison, are now the tools of feeding, bandaging, comforting, and reading. I teach them the names of colors and the small laws of sharing. I have published a book that is not a manifesto, but a record, a call to vigilance, and a way to share what polished, bureaucratic things we did that helped. I get emails from mothers and fathers who say, "We updated our will because of you," and that feels worth more than anything. People often ask if I have any message for those who betrayed me. I have only this to say. You cannot bury mothers. We are tenacious things. Put under a sheet, we learn how to speak. Put under pressure, we reconfigure into advocates. We do not let our children be rearranged into profit margins. There are days the twins look at me and I see both who I was and who I've become. I see fear that I carry like a shadow. I see a determination that has replaced the softer edges of naivety. I see a community that held us up. The nurses who refused to let a party go unremarked. The social worker who documented the right phrases. The lawyer who acted fast enough. The friends who kept our kids in their arms when I could not. I tell this story because it's true, and because truth has power. There are people out there who would try to monetize grief, who would twist policy and family ties into a scheme. There are also people out there who will listen, intervene, and stand up. The scales of justice are imperfect, but in our case, they tipped long enough for the children to be protected. If you want to hear the whole unbelievable story, stay tuned. And if what you've heard so far matters to you, subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes viewers ask me if I would do anything differently. Not much. Maybe I would have trusted my instincts sooner. Maybe I would have been louder in the first week. Maybe I would have given my parents the green folder earlier. But regrets are slippery. They are the things that can eat you. Instead, I try to teach and to act. There are pragmatic points that lawyers and judges noted in court. The camera at home recorded the party. A nurse kept a contemporaneous note of what she had overheard. Bank statements showed the initial transfers. Text messages between the conspirators showed a timeline of intent. Those evidentiary bits mattered because they turned gossip into proof. The court did not base its decision on emotion. It based it on documents, testimony, and intent. Don't underestimate the value of documentation. The world sometimes treats mothers like an afterthought in the bureaucratic machinery of life and death decisions. I hope my story shows that a parent's rights are not merely sentimental, they are procedural and legal. The trust that now holds the insurance proceeds is not just a financial tool, it is a promise that the girls will not be sold into private arrangements and that there is an accountable steward in my father's lawyer. Today, when I watch Hope and Grace chase each other in the yard, I feel a kind of humble triumph. They are safe, messy, loud, and alive. They reach for things and tumble and get up again. I teach them the names of the people who kept them safe. I tell them in simple terms that some people make bad choices and that the important thing is to make good ones in return. If you ever find yourself in a hospital bed and your intuition tells you something is off, if a family member seems too eager about insurance or too intent on private arrangements, document, call a lawyer, and find an ally in hospital staff. It's not a dramatic line in a movie, it's practical and often effective. This is not a story about vengeance. It is about the reassertion of agency. I was declared dead during childbirth, and for a time they treated me as though I were done. But I was not done. I listened. I kept my small, strange record of paranoia. I opened my eyes. I named my children. I told what I heard, and the law, for all its slowness, answered with force enough to keep my daughters safe. If this moved you, please like and share this story so others can learn what to watch for. And if you want to hear more true stories of survival, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening.